Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today I'll be watching Early Muslim Expansion Part 1 of 4 by Kings and Generals. So, since this video is almost 2 hours long, I'll be breaking my reaction down into 4 parts. In each part, I will be reacting to about 30 minutes of the video, and so this is the first part of that series. I'm excited to get into this one. We've done some stuff associated with this, mostly from the Byzantine perspective, but not much else, so I'm really excited to learn more about the topic. Though I do have a question for you guys who are a fan of this whole series, so I'm just going to bring this out here. And I'm looking at the whole Early Muslim Expansion playlist, and we start off with this 2-hour one, so my question is, all of these videos afterwards, the shorter ones, should I also watch those? Or are they covered in this longer video? I'm just trying to decide if I should watch all of these videos, or do I only need to watch the really long, collection videos, or what? I basically need a watch guide for this whole series. So I'd appreciate it if you guys would let me know how exactly I should go through this. But regardless, I'm going to start with this one. It'll take us a bit to get through this since it's so long. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's get into the first part of Early Muslim Expansion.
Almost 1,400 years ago, the ancient and prosperous lands of the Middle East were on the verge of a conflict of 3 empires and 3 religions. 2 of them fighting a constant, bloody and fruitless war for centuries, one a newcomer looking to make its mark. The newcomer was the Rashidan Caliphate, and its arrival would change the history of the region and the world forever.
I mean, this is very true. Obviously, if we look at our modern history, Islam has had a massive impact throughout the world, but in addition, just in these early days, to my understanding, obviously, in the period we're talking about, Islam was a new arrival, and yet it quickly made a massive impression on the region around it. A lot of conquests, a lot of territory taken, really successful Muslim raids on surrounding empires. So despite the fact that it was relatively young at this point, those around were definitely noticing.
The Roman state was almost constantly at war with the Iranian empires ever since the 2 entities touched borders in the 60s BC, as the Parthian Empire achieved a famous victory at Carrhae.
Yeah, the Persians had, or the Persians, the Iranians, the Parthians, many different names throughout the years, but basically the Persians and the Romans were, sort of main rivals. The Persians were perhaps the main rivals to the Roman Empire for, a while. And these two were sort of directly opposing each other all the time. And this would last for hundreds and hundreds of years, though in this series, I reckon we will see a big disruption to that rivalry.
The Roman Republic transitioned into the empire, and then this empire's western portion was lost to foreign invasions, leaving only the Eastern Roman Empire, while the Parthian Empire was replaced by the Sassanid Empire. But even then, these 2 states continued to fight. In the 3rd century AD, another factor was introduced to these conflicts: the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids. These 2 Arab tribal confederations migrated from modern Yemen and became the vassal states of the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanids respectively. They participated in the Roman-Sassanid wars, often as scouts or raiders detached from the armies.
And this was a common role for nomadic peoples throughout this area. They would do some of their own raiding, and they would often be members of the armies of bigger empires like the Romans or the Persians, serving as cavalry or scouts. So this kind of follows tradition, and I'm somewhat familiar with these tribes, though not really, just due to my sort of general knowledge of Byzantine history, but, very general. I don't have any specific expertise in this area.
Or as light cavalry units within the armies, while also defending both empires from the Arab tribal raids from the south. The populations of these kingdoms worshipped traditional Arab paganism and Monophysite Christianity, and the latter created tensions with their suzerains, as the Sassanids were sure that any Christian influence may strengthen their Roman enemies, while the Romans adhered to Miaphysite Orthodox Christianity, which considered monophysitism to be heretical.
Yeah, there was a lot of arguing and debate within the early Orthodox Church, and I guess the early Christian Church overall. And I say early, but you know, there's been constant debate among Christians since Christianity has existed up to the modern day. But the Miaphysites and the Monophysites were two sort of big sects, or maybe sects isn't the right word, but you know, they were, you know, pretty opposed in early Christianity, and the Miaphysites would end up predominating. But this was a big debate and a big controversy in early Christianity.
The Roman attempts to suppress monophysitism caused the Ghassanids to rebel against them in the late 6th to early 7th century, and weakened Roman support in the area. On the other hand, religious tensions between the Lakhmids and the Sassanids were compounded by the attempts of Shah Khosrow II to control the region directly. In 602, he captured and executed the Lakhmid king Al-Numan III, turning the kingdom into a province administered by a governor. That forced the Lakhmid tribes to ask their Arab brethren to the south for help. Although the allied forces managed to defeat the Sassanid army at Dikar in 609, the Sassanids were able to keep the province under their rule. This sequence of events not only created divided loyalties among the Arab tribes in the region, but effectively stripped the Sassanid border of its traditional buffer. Despite that, the Sassanids were still very strong. In 602, they used the internal strife within the Eastern Roman Empire as a pretense to declare war.
Yeah, and this is another singular instance of a common trend. I mean, if you look at the Sassanids and the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantines if you want to call them that, these are two massive empires spanning over a very large amount of territory that often have instability. And so, you know, obviously it was in the interest of one empire if the other one was going through a crisis to try and invade or take some territory. So this is something we see a lot throughout this era. You know, the two empires take advantage of the instability of the other. Makes sense.
Sassanids scored a number of impressive victories in the first years of the war, and although the Roman noble Heraclius took the throne in 611 and started to stabilize the situation, he wasn't able to slow down the enemy completely. By 621, the Sassanids controlled the South Caucasus, the Levant, Egypt, and most of Anatolia, which marked the largest extent of their territory.
Wow. Yeah, I did not know it extended that far. That is an extremely impressive stretch. Plus, they're eating into a lot of Roman territory.
Even though Emperor Heraclius was forced to fight against the Avars in Europe too, he was able to gain some momentum by winning 2 battles against the Sassanids between 622 and 625.
Yeah, this was a pretty remarkable event where the Emperor, Heraclius, personally led troops against the Sassanids. You know, this was a pretty rare sight by this era of Roman history. Sort of shows you how desperate the Romans were getting and how much territory had been taken away from them, that Heraclius, the emperor, was willing to personally lead men to reclaim it.
According to some sources, Khosrow enlisted all men capable of fighting and turned the tide again. In 626, an army under Shahrbaraz besieged the capital of the empire, Constantinople, supported by the Avars and Sclaveni from Europe. The Roman Empire was on the brink of destruction, but the defenders of the capital persevered.
Yeah, this was a pretty desperate moment, and also ended up being a testament to the strength of Constantinople. You know, it became known as a city that was sort of inconquerable. It was, those walls, you couldn't break through them. Of course, eventually it would be conquered, but we've got a long time to go until then, so bad situation for the Romans to be in, but they did manage to survive. We also see the Romans' enemies in the east, like the Sassanids, working with their enemies in the west, the Avars. So this is a pretty terrible situation.
This was the turning point in the war, as in 627, Heraclius entered an alliance with the leader of the Western Turkic Khaganate, Tongyaku, and together they invaded the Iranian heartland. Heraclius defeated the Sassanids at Nineveh in 627 and threatened the capital Ctesiphon in 628, which prompted the nobles to overthrow Khosrow. His son Kavad II became the next Shah and signed a peace treaty with Heraclius. The Sassanids paid a war indemnity, but otherwise the conflict achieved nothing, and the two exhausted empires returned to the pre-war borders.
Yeah, as you can imagine, though technically nothing had changed, this was a pretty big W for Heraclius. I mean, the empire looked like it was on the brink of falling. Roman territory being gobbled up by the Persians. The people didn't know what would happen. And then Heraclius, defeats their enemies in the west, moves out east, and beats back the Sassanids. This is a pretty impressive victory.
Meanwhile, to the south, the Arabian Peninsula was going through an upheaval. The population of this peninsula worshipped many religions, from the traditional Arab pagan beliefs to Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and Christianity.
And for those that don't know, Zoroastrianism was sort of the religion of the Persians. It's not really followed in that region much today due to, of course, the spread of Islam. But it was sort of the traditional religion of that area, Persia, which, of course, there were many different empires. So that's what Zoroastrianism is. But yeah, very diverse region religiously.
The Sassanids controlled the province of Mazun and the eastern portion of Yemen, while the deserts in the central and northern parts of the region were ruled by nomadic Bedouin Arabs. Their brethren resided in the rich merchant city-states in Hijaz. One of these city-states, called Mecca, was both a religious and economic center governed by the Quraish tribe, trading mostly spices with Aksum, the Romans and the Sassanids. In 570, a boy called Muhammad was born in the Quraysh tribe.
Here we go.
As a young man, Muhammad spent his time as a merchant, probably participating in and then leading trade caravans all over the region. As is often the case with traders, Muhammad would meet and converse with members of various religions on his travels.
I mean, this was often how religion spread, was through traders. We see example Aksum, or Ethiopia, as it would come to be known, became an Orthodox Christian state. And I think a lot of that was due to sort of trade relations with the region and diplomatic connections. So they're exactly right. Traders would be a good way to spread culture, ideas, religion, and also bring those things back to wherever they came from.
According to the later sources, he started receiving divine revelations sometime in 610. Soon, this new prophet began spreading the message of a new religion, Islam, in his home city of Mecca. However, the Meccans didn't receive it well, and in 614, they started to persecute adherents of Islam.
Yeah.
All this prompted Muhammad and his followers, the Muslims, to emigrate to Medina in 622. This started a war between the Muslims and Mecca, and by 629, the latter lost and was conquered.
Muhammad must have been a pretty remarkable fellow to garner such a following and be able to be so militarily successful from the offset, Of course, there were some struggles initially, kicked out of Mecca, but a pretty quick turnaround, I would say.
According to the early Muslim source.
And, also, I feel like since we're talking about, basically the creation of Islam, Muhammad, I should sort of address how I cover it. So, I come at it from a secular perspective, right? So, in terms of the religion itself, of course, all respect the religion and those who practice it. But the way I'm going to look at this is through the eyes of, I think, secular history, right? I'm not going to look at it through a religious or spiritual perspective. And if you want to look at these events that way, that's completely fine. I have no problem with that. You know, you can believe whatever you want to believe, right? But the way I'm going to look at it is the way I look at all history, which is I'm going to try and be empirical, and like I said, through the lens of secular historiography, but always respectful, you know, as I am of all kinds of history. So I felt like, you know, I should sort of cover how exactly I'm going to talk about this and examine this, which is the same that I do all history. It's just when we talk about religious history, whatever religion it may be, some questions do emerge because, you know, religious people will often look at it differently than they would other history. I won't be doing that. I'll be sort of examining it as I do most other history.
At this point, sometime in 628, Muhammad sent envoys to the neighboring states, urging their leaders to join Islam and bow to the one God, Allah. The Sassanid Shah Khosrow II insulted the Muslim envoy, while the one sent to the Romans was killed in Ghassanid territory. This prompted an attack by a small Muslim army, which was defeated by the Ghassanids and Romans in September of 629 at Mu'tah. The same sources claim that Muhammad decided to lead a 30,000-strong army into the Byzantines' territory to retaliate.
I remember there was a story, probably a false story, about one of the Roman emperors. It may have been Heraclius. I'm not sure, someone can correct me on this. But the story was basically that one of the Roman emperors had received sort of outreaches regarding Islam, and that they had basically considered converting, and that they had, you know, talked to their subordinates about it. But everybody who they talked to was like, not a chance, you know, we're a Christian nation. And the emperor was kind of like, yeah, forget about it. Yeah, I wasn't being serious anyway. But of course the idea is that, well, one of the Roman emperors, maybe Heraclius, like I said, someone give me the details, I'm not sure, but one of the Roman emperors really considered converting to Islam, but, you know, just barely didn't.
And took the city of Tabuk. However, most modern sources do not agree with this account of events. In any case, the conquests of Muhammad in Arabia continued. By 631, most of the Arabian Peninsula was under Muslim control.
Impressive.
Muhammad passed away a year later. There are conflicting sources regarding the succession process.
Yeah, and I think this is where, you know, I was talking about looking at it through the eyes of secular history. This is where it can be difficult because, I mean, if we're talking about ancient history, it's always a struggle to find accurate sources and find enough sources to really confirm what we believe. But in a case like this, if you don't know, the succession to Muhammad was a very controversial event in the Muslim world. And so, with such a, you know, religiously charged event, you're probably going to have a hard time finding, like, non-biased, accurate sources of what actually happened. So, yeah.
But one of the closest allies of Muhammad, Abu Bakr, became his successor with the title of Caliph.
And Abu Bakr was a, you know, great general, very skilled and competent.
He was the first of the Rashidan Caliphs. In the meantime, Khalid II, who became the Sassanid Shah in February of 628, immediately started killing his brothers to secure the throne, which resulted in deepening disagreements between the Persian and Parthian nobles.
Yeah, and this was a practice which, you know, we sometimes see in monarchical states, sometimes not, sometimes we do. It's a particularly brutal way of doing it. The Byzantines, if there were, you know, potential claimants to the throne, they would be more likely to blind them or disable them, which is also, you know, horrific, but I guess in this case the merciful option, because you're not just being straight up executed. You know, either way, if you're a monarch in charge of your empire, and you've got potential claimants to the throne who have some sort of legitimacy, you're probably going to do something about them. And, you know, the most concrete way of dealing with them is, of course, just executing them.
Khalid died of plague in September, and although his 8-year-old son became the next Shah as Ardashir III, the empire was controlled by a member of the Parthian clique, the Vizier Ma'adad Jushnas. This deeply concerned the Persian party, so it allied with Khosrow's general Shahrbaraz. The latter attacked and took the capital in April of 630, killing Ardashir and Ma'adad-Jushnas and becoming the Shah. The Sassanid realm was now in a state of civil war. Using all that, the governors of Yemen and Mazun declared their independence from Ctesiphon, which made them easy prey for the rising caliphate. Just 40 days after Shahrbaraz took the throne, he was killed, and the leader of the Parthian faction, Farrukh Hormizd, raised Khosrow's daughter Boran to the throne.
Wow.
This first queen in Sassanid history was overthrown by the son of Shahrbaraz, Shapur, a few months later. To stop the war between the factions, Farrukh offered a marriage between Shapur and another daughter of Khosrow, Azarmidokht, but the latter refused, and the noble usurped the throne for himself in late 630.
And you know, we've seen this with the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire before. Just a crazy amount of dynastic drama. A lot of family drama, you know, succession drama. It just seemed to, that sort of thing seemed to really characterize this era of history. And I mean, would characterize it for a while throughout sort of the era of at least European history when there were monarchs predominantly ruling. But it does particularly seem like the Byzantines and I guess the Sassanids were had a lot of this sort of court intrigue and dynastic drama going on.
He would be killed by the supporters of Azarmidokht in 631, after which she took the throne for herself. Farrukh's son Rostam marched his troops to Ctesiphon to avenge his father, defeating Azarmidokht's armies along the way. After taking the capital, he restored Boran as the queen. The ruling alliance of Boran and Rostam managed to convince the leader of the Persian clique, Pyrrhus, to stop the hostilities. However, after Rostam left the capital for the frontier, Firuzan killed Boran in June of 632. Rostam then marched for the capital again. According to some sources, the armies of both Firuzan and Rostam were tired of the bloodshed and forced their generals to reach an accord. One of the last members of the House of Sassan, the 8-year-old grandson of Khosrow II, was crowned as Yazdegerd III.
Jeez.
Although the civil war was now over, the Sassanid realm was extremely vulnerable, as the Parthian clique basically controlled the northeastern portion of the empire, while Turkic raiders attacked from the Caucasus and Central Asia. At the same time, the first Caliph Abu Bakr sent a portion of his army under Usama ibn Zayd to raid the Ghassanids in June of 632, possibly checking if the Byzantine frontier was well defended.
The Byzantine frontier was often not very well defended. I'm sure at specific times it was, but generally, and remember I'm talking very generally, the Byzantine frontier was not very well guarded and was sort of guarded by underpaid, undersupplied border guards.
The death of Muhammad and the departure of his army made a big number of newly conquered Arab territories think that the Caliphate was fragile, and in July, all of the peninsula, save for Hijaz, rebelled against Abu Bakr in what was called the Ridda War, or the War of Apostasy, as many rebel groups were led by people who declared themselves prophets.
I guess if it hasn't been that long since one successful prophet arose, you know, you might try it yourself, huh?
The situation was most dire around Medina, as the rebels threatened the second most important city of the new realm in late July. However, Abu Bakr swiftly marched to the area and defeated the rebels in early August. That gave enough time for the army, which was sent north and defeated a small Ghassanid army around Muta, to return. Abu Bakr proved to be a talented commander. Instead of uniting his armies and marching on each of the rebel groups separately, which would have allowed the rebels to attack his rear with impunity, he divided his army into smaller groups, and these units attacked the enemies around the peninsula.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't know too much about Abu Bakr, but he does seem to be a pretty dynamic and skilled general. Also, just, I think it's interesting that, Islam has basically just popped into existence, right? We've only just had the Prophet Muhammad, and we're on his first successor, and, we already have a pretty powerful Muslim empire. I mean, it's just interesting if you look at, let's say, Christianity. It was a sort of underground religion for the oppressed for a long time before it became the religion of the empire. It took Christianity, really a good, couple decades, couple hundred of years before it would become the predominant religion of the Roman Empire, the official religion of the Roman Empire. But, Islam, probably due to, obviously due to the different circumstances, it's basically founded, if you want to use that word, and then not long afterwards, we have a pretty successful Muslim empire. It's really fascinating.
This strategy worked to perfection, and by March of 633, the Caliph's rule over the entire region was restored. It is difficult to assess how much the Caliphate lost in terms of manpower, but the sources underline that the generals and troops gained invaluable experience in this conflict. While the Ridda Wars were going on, the leader of the Arab Bani Bakr tribe, Muthanna bin Haritha, was raiding the Sassanid territories in southern Iraq. The Sassanid civil wars made this frontier subject to attacks, and Muthanna, who adopted Islam sometime in the 630s, informed Abu Bakr of this fact in early 633. The Caliph decided that it was a good time to take over Iraq, and one of his main generals during the Ridda Wars, Khalid ibn al-Walid, was ordered to invade the region. Khalid was able to recruit an army of 18,000 at his base at Yamamah and left for Iraq in late March 633. A letter was sent to the Sassanid governor of Dast Maisan, Hormozd, demanding his surrender. Hormozd obviously didn't, but sent a letter to the capital, asking Shah Yazdegerd III for reinforcements. This letter was probably a trick by Khalid, as Hormozd gathered his 20,000 and marched out of the capital of his governorship, Uballa, to defend the crucial road from Yamamah near Kazima. Khalid, however, moved his troops through the desert and threatened Hufir. The Sassanid leader was informed of this and had to march towards Hufir via Uballa.
Very smart. Clearly, like I said, we're not long into this empire existing, but it's already quite expansionist, and we've clearly got some pretty skilled leaders and generals involved.
According to the Muslim sources, that was exactly what Khalid was hoping would happen. Despite the civil wars, Sassanid armies were still stronger, as their armor and weaponry made them superior, and the only tangible advantage the Caliph's forces had was their mobility. Khalid was going to use this mobility to tire the Sassanid army.
I guess that makes sense. If we think about the region that the Caliphate covered, it's Arabia. There are a lot of nomadic peoples in that area. There are definitely a lot of settlements, a lot of rich settlements too, but I guess you would expect their forces to be more mobile, probably a lot of cavalry, but perhaps less well-armed against, or at least in comparison to the Sassanids.
This would become one of the most important elements of the early Muslim expansion. Their mobility and aggression were forcing their foe to defend multiple cities and fortresses, as it was never clear where the Arabs would strike. By the time Hormozd reached Hufir, Khalid started marching to Kazima. He could have probably taken the city with ease, but didn't want to be besieged by the heavily armored Sassanids.
Yeah, and this is exactly the benefit of having a more mobile force. And you can look at this with both the Persians and the Romans struggling to fight off nomadic neighbors, nomadic enemies. These are two massive empires. They have a lot of territory to protect. Not to mention that their forces, their armies are, a lot less mobile. They're heavily armored. They're a lot more sedentary than a nomadic force. And so they have this issue whenever they're facing nomadic horsemen. You know, they don't know where they're going to strike. They can't chase them, so they basically have to be on high alert. And of course, that's the benefit of having walled cities, is that, you know, you can hide inside your walled city and hopefully resist the nomadic cavalry. But we're basically seeing that dynamic play out here. It's a pretty familiar dynamic. Of course, this would become much larger in scale and would be much more important than some random nomadic tribe raiding against the Romans or the Sassanids.
So his troops waited and rested to the south of Casimir, while Hormozd marched towards him. In the first days of April, the tired Sassanid forces approached. The engagement that would occur in the area is traditionally known as the Battle of the Chains, due to the description of the Sassanid forces in the Muslim sources. According to them, the Sassanid infantrymen were chained to each other to create a cohesive line, or to prevent any retreat.
Jeez.
However, this makes no sense tactically, as that would have made the infantry even less mobile.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's kind of a cool idea, I guess, but I don't think you would ever actually do that, because that means that, you know, none of your infantry units can move independently. In terms of strategy, it would just be a horrific idea.
And each dead warrior would have burdened their companions.
Yeah.
We also never see this description in the numerous battles fought between the Romans and the Sassanids. Most probably, this stems from an incorrect reading of the Persian word silsilah, which can be translated as a mountain chain, a bounding chain, or a single line of soldiers. So the word chain might be a metaphor for the disciplined Sassanid infantry.
Okay.
In any case, Khalid wasn't going to allow Hormozd's troops to rest, and his preparations forced the Sassanids to form up directly to the west of Casimir at the end of the tiring march. Their formation was the traditional infantry centre and cavalry wings. Meanwhile, Khalid's army was arranged in a similar manner, but for the time being stayed in the desert behind the hills dividing the two armies. This delay only added to the fatigue among the Sassanids, as they had to stay in formation in their full panoply under the sun. However, this waiting couldn't continue for long, as the Sassanids controlled the springs in the area, so a few hours later, Khalid emerged on the hills and his troops stopped some distance away from those of Hormozd.
Ooh.
The only surviving primary sources of this engagement belong to the Muslim historians, so we will present their view of this battle.
I'm glad that they're talking and recognizing the sources that they're using and the limitations of those sources. Like I mentioned earlier, you know, we do not have a lot of sources from this era, particularly, well, honestly, anywhere around this area. You know, even if you look at Byzantine history, we are pretty short on sources compared to other eras of Roman history. So we have to work with what we've got. In addition, you know, I'm glad they pointed this out. We only have Muslim sources for this encounter, so obviously, just as we would any other source, we have to really examine the bias and try to pick out what actually happened. You know, every source that we use has bias, and we always have to recognize that and try and work out how exactly that bias influences what is being, the information that's being delivered to us. And it seems like, you know, Kings and Generals is very cognizant of that, of course. So I appreciate that, basically.
As was customary for the region, and traditional for the Roman, Sassanid, and Arab battles of the era, the battle started with a duel, as Hormozd moved forward and called Khalid to fight him one-on-one.
Whoa.
Apparently, Hormozd then dismounted, and Khalid followed suit. As the two generals clashed and fought to a standstill, a few Sassanid skilled warriors attacked Khalid. Another Arab general, Kaka bin Amr, who will play a larger role in the future, saw this and also decided to join the fray, attacking Khalid's assailants. Kaka and Khalid were able to overcome the Sassanid fighters and killed Hormozd. The Arab generals returned to their lines, and Khalid ordered his troops.
Yeah, so the sort of one-on-one single combat dueling was something that happened, but if we look at sources from this era, and we can see this, I'm most familiar with Roman sources, but these duels were often, you know, used as a way to really pump up the reputation of the commander. and were often, they were often misrepresented in the sources. So obviously, that the information we had about that duel right there made the Muslim generals look really cool and strong. It may not have exactly gone that way. You have to keep that in mind. Maybe it did. Maybe they really did overpower their Persian foes, but if you look at a situation and you're like, wow, this makes one side look really good, always consider, is it exactly true? Or does the person writing this have some sort of bias or ulterior motive? And of course, in this case, we're looking at Muslim sources, so they want to make their own side look really good, of course. We see this with all sorts of sources, so we just have to keep that in mind.
Forward. The armies engaged each other. On the wings, the balance of forces didn't allow either side to gain the upper hand. While in the center, the Muslim infantry charged their counterparts a few times, clashing and falling back without dealing much damage. However, the Muslim troops were much more rested, as even the infantrymen had travelled to the battle mounted. The Sassanid footmen weren't able to rest after their march, and each charge tired them even more. During one of the charges, Khalid's center managed to crack the disciplined Sassanid line in a few places. The Sassanid army, which was left leaderless in the wake of the duel, panicked, and the commanders leading the wings, Qubaz and Anushjan, started retreating with their horsemen. Their Muslim cavalry counterparts didn't chase the enemy horsemen, and instead enveloped the Sassanid center. Soon the battle was over. We don't have a clear source on the number of casualties, but it is probably fair to assume that half of the Sassanid army was lost, while Khalid's casualties were less than a few thousand.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Shah Yazdegerd, who received Hormozd's letter in late March, decided to send an army under Karinz to reinforce his governor. The speed at which it happened suggests that only the forces around the capital were gathered. According to the sources, Karinz had somewhere between 15 and 25,000 men when he moved south and crossed the Tigris. He was apparently moving towards Uballa to help the governor, but after he crossed the small river named Makil, he encountered the rest of Hormozd's army led by Qubaz and Anushjan, some 10,000 troops. Karinz was told about the events of the Battle of the Chains. Simultaneously, a mobile force commanded by Muthanna appeared nearby, probably sent by Khalid to chase the remainder of the Sassanid force and scout ahead, while he was recruiting from the ranks of the Arab tribes in the area of Kazima and Hufir. We don't know what Karinz was thinking at this point, but it is clear that the Sassanids understood that they were not dealing with a minor raid, and they faced a traditional Bedouin Arab army made up of light cavalry. Catching Muthanna's mobile force in the open field would be impossible, since the Shah's army was considerably slower, so Karinz didn't move to the strategically crucial Uballa to protect it, likely worried that Muthanna would be able to attack his flank and rear. The Sassanid general decided to sacrifice Uballa and keep his position along the river in order to prevent Khalid from crossing the Tigris, and also from marching westwards to the most important city of the region.
Yeah, so obviously we don't know exactly what our friend Karinz here was thinking. We're kind of having to assume and try to work out what he could have been thinking. But we can see kings and generals working through the rationale or the strategy that, Sassanid or also Roman commanders would be thinking when facing a force like this. They're just not nearly as fast as their Muslim opponents, so they can't really chase them through the desert because they're not going to catch them. And there's also decisions to be made about, here he's basically deciding to, sacrifice this city in order to keep his position. Obviously, he could have went the other way. He could have said, you know what, I have to defend, Persian territory. That's what I'm here to do. So, there's a pretty complex, thing going on here. It really has to work out what strategy to pursue because he's kind of in the more difficult position. It's his territory that's being invaded. It's a Persian territory that's being invaded, and the Persians have to decide exactly how they're going to defeat these opponents that they're going to have a really hard time catching in the open field.
Al-Hira. In the meantime, Khalid was informed by Muthanna that a new army was moving to the south. The Sassanid position left him no other way to advance. Using the whole army to take Uballa might have entrapped him, so only a small group was sent to take it, while Khalid went on and united with Muthanna. The battle that is now known as the Battle of the River took place in the 3rd week of April. The Sassanids had anywhere from 25 to 50,000 troops, depending on the sources, while Khalid commanded around 18,000, as he was able to reinforce his army by recruiting from the local Arab tribes.
Okay, well, he is definitely outnumbered, though, I mean, these are some pretty big forces we're talking about, particularly for this era.
The sources for this battle are conflicted, so we will try to do our best to form a coherent narrative.
Okay.
Before the armies formed up in the morning, Khalid personally scouted the positions of Karinz's forces and was now sure that winning a set-piece battle was his only option to continue the campaign. He returned, and the armies started to get into formation, both having a similar structure with infantry in the center and cavalry on the wings. The Sassanid army was deeper, as its commander made no attempts to widen his front and outflank the enemy, probably relying on the superiority of his troops and the fact that his second rank would be fresh when the time came. The battle started with Karinz calling for a duel.
Once again?
According to the Sassanid sources, duels were a way for the commanders to prove to the troops that they were ready to fall for them, so a personal combat between champions was a usual sight.
I mean, I can see that perspective. If your commander's willing to go out there and actually fight one-on-one, that does prove that he is willing to die for you, and that would probably instill a certain level of loyalty. Then again, you also have a pretty high risk of your commander going out there and getting killed, and now your army is leaderless or goes to the second in command, so that is a pretty big risk to take.
Khalid wanted to answer the call, but one of the duelists who was near him galloped towards the Sassanid commander, and Khalid stayed back. In the ensuing duel, the Arab fighter was able to defeat his opponent. That demoralized the Sassanids, so Qubaz and Anushjan were probably forced to march forward and demand another duel.
Once again, the Sassanids are really not having good luck with these duels.
To restore their morale. The Muslim wing commanders, Asim and Adi, galloped to them. Soon, the Sassanid commanders were dead, and Khalid ordered his entire army forward.
Jesus!
Despite the fact that the Sassanids lost all of their top commanders, initially this charge was fruitless, as the forces of the Caliphate failed to make any headway and were even pushed back. But this pushback made the Sassanid lines disorganized, as the units lost cohesion due to the lack of command. Yeah,
that was a really bad situation for the Sassanids. That duel was a bit of a sunk cost fallacy, I think. You know, your commander goes in, gets killed, and then your two wing commanders are like, well, you know, we've got to prove our worth now to the men. We have to go and duel. When obviously it would have been better at that point if at least one of them had been like, you know what, I'm going to hold back. This army needs somebody to command it. Yet that is not what happened, and now the Sassanids are completely leaderless. I mean, I'm sure someone or some people were trying to take command and direct the men at this moment, but, you know, clearly the cohesion has been lost.
Khalid was able to exploit this, and his counterattack created even more holes in the enemy formation. The rear of the Sassanid army attempted to retreat, while the front was still fighting. However, left with no support, the front was soon massacred.
Ooh.
Lightly equipped and fast Muslim troops were able to catch up to the fleeing Sassanids with ease, and the battle restarted along the river. The sources do not give a clear picture of what happened here, but most of the Sassanid losses occurred in that area, as some were killed, some drowned, and some were able to cross the river.
Jesus.
By the end of the battle, the Shah's army lost anywhere from 15 to 30,000 troops, while Khalid's casualties were in the hundreds.
Yeah, another major defeat for the Sassanids. You know, we've seen 2 major encounters so far, and the Sassanids are getting whooped.
After the victory at the Battle of the River, Khalid didn't cross into central Iraq, probably for a variety of reasons. Firstly, he needed to create a new administration in the region and start collecting taxes. Secondly, moving into the Sassanid Empire would have stretched his supply lines, and would have put him into territory with no Arab tribes. On top of that, Khalid liked to fight on the edges of deserts, which gave him the opportunity to outmaneuver his opponents when needed.
Yeah.
The Caliphate's commander established a new authority in the province, with its inhabitants starting to pay the jizya tax. Simultaneously, scouts from the local tribes were sent to the west and north to discover if the Sassanids had more armies nearby. As the Persian road and postal system were probably among the best of their time, the Shah learned about another defeat shortly after, and while Khalid was making his preparations, Yazdegerd ordered the troops from the northern and eastern parts of the empire to march towards the capital, Ctesiphon. A direct attack on the region controlled by Khalid was difficult, as the Arabs now controlled the crossings. So when the first army, commanded by Andazagar, arrived, it was sent towards the city of Walaja, the first strategic target on the road between Uballa and al-Hira. It was expected that the Arabs would attack in this direction, so the remnants of the Sassanid forces which fought under Karins joined Andazagar, bringing his numbers to somewhere between 25 and 30,000 troops.
Once again, we see the Persians are mobilizing a lot of troops in these armies. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands. We may have reached perhaps 100,000 total Persian troops that we've seen. So, I mean, I guess I'm not really familiar with what sort of resources the Persians had available to them. I'm more familiar with what the Romans had, but I know that if the Romans were to mobilize this many men, that would be, I mean, we're talking about an almost full mobilization. I mean, you've got to be really desperate at that point. And so I'd imagine the Persians may be getting at least a little desperate. They're sending tens of thousands of troops to fight, you know, this, you know, these nomads who have come into their territory and are now conquering cities and setting up their own administration, and it's not working. They keep getting beaten. So if you're the Shah, you know, at least I would be getting very worried at this point.
This army took positions outside of Walaja sometime in May. The Second Army was led by one of the top commanders in the Sassanid army, Bahman, and it was supposed to reinforce Andazagar if the Muslims indeed decided to move to al-Hira. For now, this force of 20,000 was to be stationed along the Euphrates, halfway between Uballa and Walaja. Meanwhile, Khalid's scouts, being from the local tribes, were able to gather information with impunity, so he seemingly knew about every enemy move. He decided that his smaller force needed to defeat one of the armies opposing him, and he could not allow them to reinforce each other.
Alright, you know, I was planning on going a little bit longer, but I think this is a good stopping point. It's a bit of a cliffhanger. Apologies for ending it like this, but there's no, I don't think there's any set ending points in this video, and like I said, I'm trying to split it into 4 parts, so I have to make a decision on when to end each part. So I'm gonna end this one here. You know, of course, we've got the next part coming up relatively soon, so you can stay tuned for that. Yeah, I found this really fascinating. You know, I don't know much about early Muslim expansion, you know, the name of the series. So I'm, you know, excited to be getting a lot more detail on something which I only know very vaguely. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this, I'd appreciate it if you check out my Patreon, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. Once again, I would also appreciate it if you would give me some advice on how exactly to watch this series. Do I just watch the longer ones? Do I watch every video? And maybe if you have any suggestions for how to break this one up, since it's so long. If not, I'll just keep doing what I've been doing. I got to about the 25-minute mark, so almost 30 minutes. I'll do the same next time. So yeah, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.